What is the most powerful position in the world? Perhaps today, that isn't an easy question to answer. In truth, it isn't actually a question I care much to answer at all. But it is relevant that at this moment we recognize something. Geopolitical landscapes have changed dramatically since the beginning of the 20th century. Like an ocean, power ebbs and flows. It pushes and pulls around the planet. Sometimes a leader's influence wanes in total strength, and sometimes a nation sets the standard that much of the rest of the world follows. The lines of power on the world stage may be sitting at an inflection point right now, though I don't believe it's especially controversial to say there is one position that has been almost universally acknowledged as the most powerful office on planet Earth for much of the last 100 years. The Commander-in-Chief, the President of the United States. Power can mean a great many things, of course. Even today, the President presides over the world's largest economy and commands the most dominant military force humanity has assembled. But tonight, I'm interested in another kind of power. Power over the unknown. Many consider the inception of modern ufology to be 1947. And if you need to ask why, may I gently suggest a different room for your stay tonight. I believe the Roswell room is down the corridor to the left. Since that year, the President of the United States has become closely entwined with the conspiracies, stories, and rumors that spun outward from the events of that summer. Every president since then seems to have their own story to tell, some slightly more interesting than others, some stranger than others. And tonight, we're going to examine each one closely. Because I suspect what we might find is a deeply worrying story of diminishing control, and perhaps the transformation of a secret once established beneath the authority of the president into a secret withheld from them, concealed from them, protected from them, possibly with consequences that are deeply disturbing. For what purpose? Well, that's the million-dollar question. Welcome to the Dreamland Motel. If you're a returning visitor, it's good to see you again. If you're new here, settle in, and please consider liking, subscribing, and leaving your thoughts with a comment card below. I do read every single one. I'd also like to personally thank our residential guests on YouTube and our Patreon members for their generous contributions, all of which help keep the bedsheets crisp and the motel pool from being condemned. Tonight you'll be staying in room 35, and it's happy hour down at the motel bar right now, so please enjoy. Drop your bags off, grab a drink, and let's dive in. When people tell the story of modern ufology, they usually begin in a desert, a ranch, a newspaper headline, fragments scattered beneath the New Mexico sun. But tonight we'll leave much of that story resting quietly in its room down the hall. Roswell has already had its evening with us. Because while 1947 gave us one mystery, it may also have given us something that receives far less attention. Structures, institutions and systems created in its wake. If Roswell marked the beginning of a question, then 1947 may also have marked humanity's attempt to create an answer to it. The world Harry Truman inherited had changed profoundly. The Second World War had ended only 2 years earlier, and humanity had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. Nuclear weapons existed now. Entire cities had vanished in moments. Radar systems had become increasingly sophisticated, and rockets once designed for war had begun pointing humanity toward the sky. Across Washington, there was a growing sense that the modern world had become deeply uncertain. Threats no longer arrived on horseback or by sea. They could now emerge from thousands of miles away, pass overhead with little warning, and increasingly, strange things also seemed to be appearing above. That same year, Truman signed the National Security Act of 1947 into law, one of the most significant reorganizations in modern American history. From it emerged institutions that would shape the Cold War era: the Central Intelligence Agency, the United States Air Force, and the National Security Council. These new structures were built around information, threat assessment, secrecy, and compartmentalization, all terms that become very familiar if you spend enough late nights reading UFO history. If unusual objects truly were appearing in American skies, whether they represented misunderstood natural phenomena, advanced foreign technology, or something far stranger, the implications would have felt extraordinary. Imagine being a military planner in 1947. The war had only recently ended, and already relations with the Soviet Union were beginning to deteriorate, and the Cold War had already started quietly moving through the walls. Then reports began arriving describing strange objects moving through the sky in unfamiliar ways. Under these conditions, secrecy may have felt entirely reasonable. Regardless of what these sightings represented, immediate questions would have followed. Could another nation possess technology no one understood? Could radar capabilities become exposed? Could uncertainty itself become a strategic weapon? Could public panic spread in ways impossible to control? The answer to all of them is yes. For all the mythology that later gathered around UFO secrecy, there were practical reasons a government might decide unusual aerial events should remain contained. Mysteries become especially uncomfortable when they overlap with national defense. And Harry Truman, publicly at least, appeared remarkably calm about the matter. During a July 1947 press conference, amid America's first major flying saucer wave, Truman was asked whether he had seen any flying saucers himself. His answer was wonderfully brief. Quote, "Only in the newspapers," perhaps marking the beginning of the standard humorous dismissal, which would become a characteristic of presidents to come. Officially, Truman never presented himself as a president deeply fascinated by flying saucers, and public records from his administration remain surprisingly restrained. But privately, things become somewhat less clear. Years later, Truman's Air Force aide, General Robert Landry, described something that I find interesting. He claimed Truman requested periodic intelligence assessments concerning unidentified aerial incidents and whether they represented strategic threats. Landry described oral briefings rather than dramatic secret ones, which feels entirely plausible. A president asking whether unknown objects in American skies represented a national security concern would hardly be unusual. Around the same period, the Air Force quietly established its earliest formal UFO investigations. Project Sign arrived first, followed by Project Grudge, eventually evolving toward what many listeners will recognize as Project Blue Book. These were real programs, documented and organized within existing military structures. But this is where Harry Truman's story begins drifting into stranger territory, because while documented history shows military investigations and the emergence of formal structures, another narrative slowly developed alongside it. Over time, a much larger story began forming around Truman himself, one claiming that he did not simply oversee the birth of the modern national security state, According to decades of UFO lore, he also oversaw the birth of something hidden within it. Majestic 12, or MJ12 for short. For listeners who have spent enough evenings wandering the stranger hallways of UFO history, those letters may already feel very familiar. According to the story, following the Roswell incident, Truman allegedly authorized an ultra-secret 12-member committee composed of scientists, military officials, and intelligence figures. Their purpose was extraordinary. The group would recover crashed vehicles, study recovered technology, investigate alleged non-human biological entities, and maintain strict secrecy surrounding the entire subject. The alleged membership itself reads almost like a gathering assembled from the upper floors of 20th century power. Scientists, military commanders, intelligence directors, and men connected to wartime strategy, nuclear research, and emerging intelligence institutions all appear within the mythology. According to the story, the committee operated above traditional classification systems and reported directly to the president himself. If true, it presents a remarkable idea. A structure existing alongside government, hidden even from much of the government itself. According to researchers who support elements of the MJ12 story, fragments of that hidden architecture occasionally surfaced. Some point toward events that appear to predate Roswell entirely. According to later investigations and interpretations, individuals such as Alan Dulles, General William Donovan, and scientist Vannevar Bush had already begun discussing systems for scientific intelligence during late 1946. And then in June of 1947, just days after Kenneth Arnold's famous sighting near Mount Rainier, intelligence discussions reportedly began focusing on what officials described as an urgent and important problem. For some researchers, these moments resemble the earliest scaffolding of a much larger structure. The argument suggests that MJ12 did not suddenly emerge after Roswell, and that the framework may have already existed, just waiting for a purpose. Researchers also point to tiny details hidden within the alleged documentation itself. Not dramatic revelations or startling declarations, but small, administrative fingerprints and pieces of metadata that supporters argue would have been very difficult for a hoaxer to fabricate decades later. One frequently discussed example involves an obscure numerical code, 834021. Supporters later argued that the number appeared connected to intelligence files involving Operation Paperclip and post-war scientific recruitment efforts. And while this might just sound like a quaint coincidence connecting to another secret but albeit seemingly unrelated program, we will return to this detail later in tonight's episode. This and other seemingly tiny details become battlegrounds in stories like these, because a forged signature can expose deception, while an unexpectedly accurate filing structure can preserve uncertainty for years. Then there is perhaps the most emotionally powerful claim surrounding Truman himself, a document known within UFO circles as the White Hot Report. According to the story, the report was delivered directly to Truman in September of 47. Its contents allegedly included descriptions of recovered debris, technological assessments of propulsion systems, discussions surrounding recovered non-human bodies, and analyses claiming the craft lacked conventional wings, engines, or viable control systems. Details such as these later became deeply woven into UFO mythology. And then researchers noticed something curious. On September 21st, Truman wrote a brief diary note. Quote, "I have all sorts of things facing me." An ordinary sentence at first glance. Presidents generally have quite a lot facing them, wars, economies, and political crises. But within UFO circles, that line developed an entirely different life, because we're now forced to wonder whether Truman had spent previous days confronting something far larger, something impossible, perhaps even something capable of rearranging a person's entire understanding of reality. Historians point out that no direct evidence links the diary entry to extraterrestrial disclosure, though uncertainty has a way of inviting company, and uncertainty rarely sleeps alone. Harry Truman, publicly amused by flying saucers, privately interested enough to request threat assessments, and perhaps the president that stood at the beginning of a story where secrecy, power, and mystery all seemed to arrive at precisely the same moment. If a structure truly began here in the late 1940s, future presidents would eventually inherit it, or perhaps inherit only the illusion of control. By the time Dwight D. Eisenhower entered the White House, the architecture built during Truman's years had already begun settling into place. Intelligence channels had matured, military institutions had expanded, and the machinery of Cold War secrecy had started growing into something that no longer felt temporary. Systems originally built in response to war and uncertainty had become part of the American landscape, spreading quietly through Washington and outward into deserts, laboratories, restricted facilities, and unseen administrative corridors that would define much of the coming century. And Eisenhower understood that world better than almost anyone. Before becoming president, he had served as Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe during the Second World War, overseeing military operations on a scale almost difficult to imagine. He understood logistics, intelligence structures, classified operations, and the practical necessity of secrecy in moments where lives and history hung in delicate balance. If Truman inherited a changing world, Eisenhower entered office as someone who had already helped shape it, which makes what happened during February of 1954 especially interesting. Because among presidential UFO stories, Eisenhower's occupies a strange and unusually persistent place within the mythology. The story begins with something entirely ordinary, a brief retreat from Washington. Officially, Eisenhower had traveled to Palm Springs, California, for rest, golf, and recovery from the endless demands of presidential life. Contemporary reports described a pleasant stay at Smoke Tree Ranch beneath winter sunshine and desert skies, offering the president a temporary pause from meetings, briefings, and the machinery of government. But mysteries often emerge from very small absences. On February 20th, according to Eisenhower's appointment records, the president spent much of the day golfing, before returning to Smoke Tree Ranch later that afternoon. During the evening, somewhere between 5 and 10 o'clock, official records indicate that he damaged a dental crown and travelled into Palm Springs for treatment. On paper, there is very little about this that feels unusual. Presidents occasionally suffer from remarkably ordinary human problems, and toothaches seem to possess little respect for a political office. The difficulty emerged because during roughly that same period, reporters temporarily lost track of him. Confusion spread rapidly, enough that an Associated Press bulletin briefly and incorrectly reported Eisenhower had suffered a fatal heart attack, before quickly retracting the story. White House officials later clarified that the president had simply required emergency dental work. Under ordinary circumstances, that probably would have ended the story. Temporary confusion surrounding a president's movements during a vacation hardly feels like the beginning of one of the most enduring legends in all of ufology. but uncertainty has a way of attracting stories, particularly when the person involved happens to be President of the United States, and the setting happens to involve Cold War America. History occasionally leaves small gaps in the record, and people possess an almost irresistible instinct to lean closer whenever they discover one. Because only weeks later, another version of events quietly entered the picture. In April of 1954, a man named Gerald Light sent a letter to researcher Meade Lane, describing what he claimed had been an extraordinary experience at Muroc, later known as Edwards Air Force Base. Light was a Southern Californian metaphysician, occultist, and clairvoyant, and according to the letter, he had recently returned from a highly restricted area where events of enormous significance had supposedly unfolded behind closed doors. According to Light, he had travelled, chosen with several individuals, and gained access to facilities where multiple unusual aerial vehicles were supposedly being studied. And crucially, he also made a remarkable claim involving Eisenhower himself, stating that the president had allegedly been quietly transported to Muroc during his Palm Springs stay. The significance of the Gerald Light letter rests partly in where the story first appears. It didn't emerge from presidential archives, leaked military memoranda, or forgotten intelligence files. It appeared within the world of borderland sciences and esoteric UFO research circles, which places the account within a particular environment from its inception. And this particular story grew remarkably well. Over the following years, the Eisenhower narrative slowly changed shape. Early versions suggested the president had secretly travelled to inspect unusual materials or recovered technologies. As decades passed, the story gradually expanded until hidden inspections evolved into direct meetings, and direct meetings eventually transformed into diplomatic encounters involving visitors from somewhere beyond Earth itself, and eventually the mythology arrived at one of its most famous destinations, the alleged Greada Treaty. But how did that evolution of the story take place? Gerald Light's original account emerged from a very different world than the UFO culture most people recognize today. As mentioned previously, Light wrote to Borderland Sciences, a group deeply interested in theosophy, psychic research, astral projection, and higher planes of existence. In that original framing, the beings were described as Etherians, entities from a higher spiritual realm rather than physical extraterrestrials arriving in machines. But over the following decades, that occult language gradually faded from the story. The Etherians became flesh and blood extraterrestrials, and Light's strange esoteric account was slowly reframed as a physical, top-secret military visit to Muroc. The story had begun dressing itself in Cold War clothing. Then, in the 1980s, the alleged MJ-12 documents gave the mythology a new architecture. The Eisenhower story now had committees, briefing papers, presidential channels, and a bureaucratic cover-up. And once that framework existed, later interpretations split the meeting into two factions. According to these later versions, Eisenhower first encountered the tall Nordics, human-looking beings who supposedly urged humanity toward nuclear disarmament and spiritual development. Eisenhower allegedly rejected their terms because America would not abandon its nuclear weapons. Then came the Greys, who offered something far more transactional. And this is where William Bill Cooper becomes central. In 1989, Cooper, a former US Naval Intelligence Briefing Team member turned conspiracy theorist, released The Secret Government, later expanding many of those ideas in his 1991 book, beyond a pale horse. Cooper took the basic February 1954 disappearance story and militarized it almost completely. In his version, the alleged agreement became known as the Grenada Treaty, sometimes rendered as the Grenada or Tau 9 Treaty. You may remember the term Tau 9 from the tales of Dan Burrish, but that's a story we won't be going anywhere near tonight. According to Cooper's telling, the Greys were permitted to abduct human beings and collect human and animal biological material, allegedly to help preserve their own dying species, and in exchange, the United States received advanced technology, which later Law linked to fiber optics, night vision, and stealth aircraft. Cooper also added the administrative horror at the center of the legend. The Greys were supposedly required to provide MJ-12 with lists of abductees, but later violated the agreement by taking far more people than permitted. And with that, the Eisenhower story had fully transformed. What began as a strange letter from an esoteric researcher became a Cold War treaty narrative involving alien factions, rejected warnings, presidential negotiations, biological sampling, advanced technology, and a hidden committee charged with managing the consequences. The same alleged committee, introduced during Truman's years, now reappeared in Eisenhower-era stories, though its role had evolved considerably. Truman allegedly created the machinery, and Eisenhower inherited it already operating, and according to supporters of the story, he relied upon it. It was MJ-12 that briefed Eisenhower regarding the visitors, explained the stakes involved, and advised him during negotiations of the treaty itself. And as we've already said, once agreements had been reached, MJ-12 became responsible for maintaining secrecy, managing technological exchanges, and overseeing aspects of the arrangement concealed from Congress and the public. What becomes interesting here is not simply the extraordinary nature of the claims, but the evolution of the relationship between the president and the institution. Because the mythology no longer presents the president as the sole authority, standing at the very top of the pyramid. Instead, the structure itself begins to appear far larger than any individual administration. And as later versions expanded even further, Eisenhower allegedly formalized MJ-12 into something more permanent. Supporters of the controversial MJ-12 briefing papers claimed Eisenhower issued directives strengthening the committee's authority and granting extraordinary control over recovered technologies, biological studies, and information management. Files transferred quietly, structures maintained, and responsibilities passed from administration to administration, while the office itself changes hands and the machinery remains. The mythology surrounding Eisenhower and MJ-12 gained another layer during the mid-1980s. Soon after Jamie Chandray's anonymous microfilm documents were delivered to him, there was another discovery, this time found in the US National Archives in Washington, D.C., hidden inside a file drawer where it had supposedly fallen between two folders. Coincidentally, another discovery made by Chandray himself. The Cutler-Twining Memo. Dated July 14, 1954, the document was purportedly written by Robert Cutler, Eisenhower's special assistant, and addressed to General Nathan Twining, Chief of Staff of the Air Force. The memo briefly references something described as an MJ-12 Special Studies project, and appears to discuss adjustments involving a presidential briefing schedule. At first glance, the document feels almost disappointingly mundane. There are no dramatic revelations, no elaborate descriptions of recovered craft, but supporters viewed the memo as one of the strongest pieces of evidence for MJ-12, because if genuine, It appeared to place Majestic directly inside the Eisenhower administration, and within official presidential channels. For believers, the significance rested in its simplicity, because the memo seemed to suggest that MJ-12 had become so integrated into government operations that its existence required little explanation, though the document immediately attracted controversy. Researchers, archivists, government investigators, and even many ufologists identified substantial problems involving filing procedures, formatting inconsistencies, and questions surrounding Robert Cutler's documented whereabouts at the time. Federal investigations eventually reviewed the MJ-12 material and dismissed the broader collection entirely, while the FBI's position regarding the documents was strikingly direct. They were considered bogus, and some ufologists even assert the possibility that the memo was planted in efforts to discredit the wider collection of MJ-12 documents. Whether that possibility carries any truth remains impossible to know, though it introduces a strangely familiar atmosphere into the Eisenhower story. Where documents appear, questions emerge, certainty drifts further away, and the structure itself somehow becomes harder to see, despite more light shining upon it. Eisenhower's involvement is far from over, however. He allegedly authorized projects operating beneath the broader MJ-12 umbrella. Names such as Project Redlight and Project Pluto later emerged from UFO literature, with claims involving recovered vehicles, reverse engineering programs, and attempts to understand unconventional technologies. And at this point, if I mentioned Holloman Air Force Base to you, what would you think of? You'd be forgiven if you're thinking of a secret videotape of a landing in 1964. But what you may not know is that there was allegedly another landing at Holloman, one that took place almost a decade before, and only a year after Eisenhower's first missing weekend trip. The story surrounding the 1955 incident is less concerned with public evidence and far more concerned with continuity, because according to the story, this was not an unexpected arrival or a dramatic first contact event. This was a follow-up. According to the mythology, Eisenhower secretly traveled to Holloman Air Force Base during February of 1955, while publicly maintaining an entirely different schedule elsewhere. Officially, the president was on a quail hunting vacation in Georgia, though according to UFO lore, another journey had quietly unfolded beneath the surface of that public itinerary. Accounts vary in their detail, which is hardly unusual within stories like this, but the broad outline remains remarkably consistent. Eisenhower's presidential aircraft, Columbine 3, landed at Holloman, where a carefully arranged meeting had been prepared in advance. One or more unconventional craft reportedly descended onto the runway, while military personnel observed nearby. Eisenhower exited his aircraft and held a private discussion, lasting roughly 45 minutes. Another craft is said to have remained overhead while the meeting took place, hanging silently above the runway as events unfolded below. Other retellings frame the encounter as a continuation of negotiations that had allegedly begun during the earlier Edwards meeting. Eisenhower's role in this particular story is central, but beneath all of this, another possibility quietly waits. Because while the mythology expanded, something very real was happening beneath Eisenhower's presidency. America was building a Cold War security apparatus on a scale unlike anything the nation had previously experienced. Classified projects expanded, advanced aerospace programs multiplied, and systems increasingly relied upon compartmentalization and restricted access. The irony here becomes impossible to ignore, because Eisenhower himself eventually seemed deeply troubled at what was taking shape around him. Years later, during his farewell address to the American public, he delivered one of the most famous warnings in presidential history, when he urged Americans to remain vigilant regarding what he called the military-industrial complex. Most people hear those words and think about defense spending, influence and political power. And regardless of your belief in the authenticity of the Majestic 12 story, Eisenhower had spent years watching systems he once had total oversight on become increasingly compartmentalized, increasingly complex, and increasingly difficult for elected leadership to fully understand. And if that possibility carries any weight at all, perhaps his warning was never solely about money or power. Perhaps it also concerned momentum, because structures built for protection occasionally continue expanding long after anyone remembers exactly where the walls were originally supposed to end. Which leaves us with an interesting question, because if Truman helped establish the machinery and Eisenhower dramatically expanded it, perhaps this chapter was never really about extraterrestrials at all. Perhaps it concerns a president standing near the beginning of an enormous structure and recognizing, long before most people, that systems, for better or worse, might continue growing long after their architects step away. Perhaps Eisenhower eventually realized that some doors, once opened, do not remain under the control of the people who first unlocked them. Truman created the power. Eisenhower lost sight of it. Before we get into this next chapter, we will be speculating on some highly controversial theories, some of which venture into very dark skies. We explore them tonight only from within the context of ufology, and the truth surrounding some of these events may never be fully known. It feels important that we remain respectful as we move through the following material. That said, we're not going to shy away from where the discussion takes us. Because when John Fitzgerald Kennedy enters the story, the atmosphere changes. The previous chapters carried the feeling of structures being built and systems quietly expanding beneath the surface of government. Truman inherited a transformed world and helped create the architecture of modern secrecy. Eisenhower stepped into that machinery, and at least within UFO mythology, may eventually have watched parts of it grow beyond his control. Then Kennedy arrived, and with Kennedy the emotional temperature of the story changes, because for the first time our narrative begins carrying tension. Truman built structures, Eisenhower developed them. UFO folklore occasionally treats Kennedy as something different altogether, the president who began pulling at threads. By the early 1960s, the world itself felt increasingly compressed. The Cold War had intensified, nuclear tensions had risen dramatically, and the distance separating political disagreement from catastrophe often felt alarmingly small. The Bay of Pigs invasion of 1961 became one of the defining moments of Kennedy's presidency, and perhaps one of the most important moments for understanding his relationship with intelligence structures. The operation failed, though perhaps more importantly, confidence failed alongside it. Because according to records and memoranda from the period, Kennedy and members of his administration became increasingly concerned with how intelligence agencies, covert operations, and executive oversight had begun interacting. Public intellectual of the time, Arthur Schlesinger Jr.'s later memorandum on CIA restructuring, warned of systems beginning to resemble what he called a state within a state, a phrase that seems so obvious now, but at the time would have been a new idea. Beneath all of this sits a question we've been quietly following since Truman. Who actually controls the machinery? Kennedy's response appears more complicated than many simplified versions of history suggest. He didn't simply sever ties with intelligence agencies, or suddenly turn against them entirely. Historical record suggests something more measured, but perhaps more interesting. Kennedy increasingly pursued tighter coordination, stronger oversight, and greater interagency communication, because hidden compartments inside systems had begun making him uncomfortable. He wanted information to flow upward. He wanted agencies speaking to one another. He wanted fewer hidden corridors. But there may have been another difficulty waiting beneath the surface, because by the time Kennedy entered office, the national security state had become deeply rooted. Layers of authority had developed that didn't neatly follow electoral cycles. Presidents arrived and departed. Administrations changed. But many of the individuals operating within those systems remained in place year after year. This idea of the temporary employee is a foundational pillar of the modern ufological discourse. Could it be that Kennedy's presidency was the so-called deep state's first attempt at operating on a need-to-know basis, irrespective of who was asking? And within UFO mythology, this is where familiar figures begin quietly stepping back into view. Allen Dulles, for example, had served as Director of Central Intelligence during the Bay of Pigs era, and was ultimately dismissed by Kennedy following the operation's failure. Historically, that much is established, but within the Majestic 12 lore, Dulles occupies a far more unusual role. According to various Majestic documents and later narratives, Dulles was allegedly an active participant within the hidden structure itself. Some stories go further still and claim he had already restricted Kennedy's access to sensitive UFO information, allegedly framing the president as a potential national security concern. You know what they say, never kick a sleeping dog. And from a ufological perspective, this is where things take a very dark turn. It's important to say that this next claim is incredibly recent, being brought to my attention only within the last week, and as such has little publicly available information surrounding it at the present time. All of it remains unverified. Many of the details are not yet fleshed out, so if you're settling into room 35 tonight, it may be worth treating what follows with a healthy pinch of salt, while we simply observe where the story leads. Because alongside the documents, intelligence disputes, and UFO memoranda surrounding Kennedy, another narrative has now emerged that attempts to explain something much larger. According to the claim, members of the Nazi research organization known as the SS Ahnenerbe established contact with non-human intelligences during the 1930s, Nordic beings. Historically, the Ahnenerbe itself was very real. Founded under Heinrich Himmler, the organization pursued ideas involving ancestry, mythology, archaeology, and concepts connected to what they described as ancestral heritage. Its activities occupied a strange territory where pseudoscience, mysticism, nationalism, and occult fascination ultimately overlapped into one abhorrent, disgusting, and completely misguided set of world views. But following the war, some individuals connected with this organization eventually arrived in the United States through programs associated with Operation Paperclip. That much belongs to documented history. Now, according to this again unverified story, contact established by these scientists through those earlier networks allegedly continued through American intelligence channels and eventually intersected with the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency. Historically, this agency coordinated aspects of Paperclip and managed the transfer of German expertise into American systems, before eventually being dissolved during Kennedy's administration in 1962. Officially, the agency had become obsolete and its work had concluded. But if one follows the logic of the mythology, another possibility emerges in the distance. What if Kennedy's growing interest in oversight, coordination, and intelligence restructuring brought him into contact with structures that had existed long before he entered office, structures that could perhaps defile the very meaning of morality? What if looking behind the curtain revealed characters waiting backstage that flew in the face of fundamental American values themselves? Now, in Chapter 1, we briefly touched upon an unusual coincidence involving Project Paperclip, and references found within later MJ-12 lore. The alleged 834021 designation, appearing in certain majestic materials, has been linked to later declassified paperclip records, creating yet another one of those strange intersections repeatedly appearing throughout this subject. Perhaps it means absolutely nothing. But here, once again, we find ourselves encountering a name we've already heard: Allen Dulles. During Operation Paperclip, Dulles served as a senior intelligence figure within the OSS and had direct involvement with elements of the post-war effort that recruited, protected, and transferred many German scientists into the United States. This is an undisputed fact. So let's spend a moment talking about some other facts regarding Dulles and the paperclip years, because they begin creating an interesting shape around the man himself. During Project Paperclip, President Harry Truman had explicitly prohibited the recruitment of active Nazi Party members and individuals implicated in war crimes. On paper, the directive appeared clear enough. But behind the scenes, Dulles and others within the intelligence apparatus aggressively reshaped this process. Intelligence dossiers were sanitized, background records were rewritten, paperclipped with new stories, and incriminating material was quietly removed or minimized. Historians later described a system where clean files were effectively layered over compromised histories, allowing preferred individuals to pass through barriers originally intended to stop them. If that process unfolded as historians describe, then something rather interesting may have occurred. A presidential mandate had been issued, boundaries had been established, and yet portions of the machinery quietly continued moving in a completely different direction. One cannot help but wonder what effect that may have had on Allen Dulles himself. Could this have shaped his understanding of power? Could these years have planted an early realization that presidential wishes could occasionally be circumnavigated, softened, redirected, or entirely ignored when larger institutional goals appeared to demand it? Because once that possibility enters the room, some of Dulles's later decisions begin appearing beneath a different light. Take Reinhard Gehlen. Gehlen had served as a major general in the Wehrmacht and directed military intelligence operations on the Eastern Front. He wasn't a scientist in the traditional Project Paperclip sense, but his value rested elsewhere. Gehlen possessed extensive intelligence networks, personnel files, and knowledge regarding Soviet operations at precisely the moment America was beginning to shift its attention toward the Cold War, and Allen Dulles wanted him. Historical accounts describe Dulles bypassing ordinary procedures to help establish what became known as the Gehlen Organization, an American-funded intelligence structure built largely from former German networks. Over time, the organization absorbed numerous former intelligence personnel, and eventually evolved into the modern West German Federal Intelligence Service. But here the story develops one of those strange echoes that we keep encountering tonight. Because according to historical accounts, veterans connected to the previously discussed SS Annenerbe eventually passed through those same structures. Evidence that they were dispersed through post-war intelligence pathways and into American research programs. And perhaps that does mean very little, but perhaps not. There's also Dr. Kurt Blom. Blom had served as Deputy Surgeon General of the Third Reich and had overseen aspects of biological weapons research during the war. Following the conflict, he stood trial at Nuremberg over allegations involving human experimentation, but he was ultimately acquitted. Later, through post-war intelligence channels and Operation Paperclip, Blom found himself moving through yet another strange corridor of Cold War history. And once again, Allen Dulles appears nearby. Because Dulles later approved one of the CIA's darkest and most infamous little side projects, MK-Ultra. Histories surrounding Operation Paperclip and post-war intelligence recruitment have long noted the uncomfortable overlap here, with figures such as Kurt Blom later becoming involved with the wider ecosystem surrounding MK-Ultra and related research efforts. Allen Dulles repeatedly seems to appear at unusual intersections where secrecy, intelligence priorities, moral compromise, and long-term strategic thinking begin overlapping in deeply unsettling ways. So now we have Kennedy, who fired Dulles from his position as CIA director and has now become something more than just a president asking difficult questions. He becomes a man tracing wires backward through walls, only to discover they appear into parts of the building he was never expected to see. Perhaps he stumbled across an apparatus that drifted far too close to some of America's darkest secrets. And perhaps hidden among layers of committees, institutions, and inherited systems, sat a familiar figure, waiting at an unusual number of crossroads. But the mythology grows darker still, because within UFO circles, another controversial document eventually surfaced, the so-called burned memo. According to the story, an anonymous source claimed to have rescued a document from destruction within CIA files. The memo allegedly referred to Kennedy using his Secret Service codename, Lancer, and included language suggesting Kennedy had begun making inquiries into activities, quote, which we cannot allow. The author of the memo remains unknown, with the name itself redacted. But it's probably fair to say that by the time this document appeared, Kennedy had accumulated more than just a few powerful disagreements. Allen Dulles immediately returns to the conversation. Though no longer Director of Central Intelligence by this point, Dulles retained considerable influence long after his official departure from the agency. Intelligence institutions possess long memories, and powerful figures rarely vanish entirely when they leave their office. Then there's John McCone, who had succeeded Dulles as director of the CIA, and who, according to official records, found himself on the receiving end of Kennedy's repeated requests for greater access and information sharing, including at least one request for UFO records. And then we arrive at James Angleton. Angleton served as the influential chief of counterintelligence for the CIA from 1954 through 1974, and became one of the most enigmatic figures in the history of American intelligence. His reputation emerged from extraordinary secrecy, relentless suspicion, and a worldview shaped by hidden networks operating beneath visible institutions. And years later, another strange thread emerged. Declassified materials revealed that Angleton's counterintelligence staff had closely monitored Lee Harvey Oswald before Kennedy's assassination. Reports describe intercepted correspondence, surveillance activity, and an extensive file on Oswald that had reportedly grown considerably before November of 1963. Some accounts later claimed Angleton possessed a dossier on Oswald, running well over 100 pages, shortly before the assassination itself. Now, none of this proves anything. But from here we take one final turn, because years later, one more document entered the story. The JFK UFO memo. Obtained in 2006 via the Freedom of Information Act by author William Lester, the memo was dated November 12, 1963, just 10 days before Kennedy's assassination. The document is presented as a memorandum from Kennedy requesting a review of UFO intelligence affecting national security and asking that unidentified cases be separated from classified military activity. The document also references NASA and discussions involving information sharing. For UFO researchers, this was gold. The timing immediately became irresistible because another authentic document, written that very same week, also exists. NSAM 271 was genuine and directed efforts toward greater American and Soviet cooperation in space exploration. Kennedy had publicly pursued ideas involving cooperation with the Soviet Union for years, and within ufology, there's another theory that suggests Kennedy wanted UFO information to be shared with the Soviets in order to avoid dangerous misunderstandings. Within the context of the Cold War, the concern almost feels understandable. Two nuclear superpowers watching their radar systems and military airspace for signs of aggression could easily misinterpret unfamiliar objects under sufficiently tense conditions. By now, perhaps, you can see the disturbing writing on the wall. Now, this is quite the conspiracy, I'll admit, because when you try hard enough, making connections in this world can occasionally become more of a game than a discovery. Human beings are remarkably talented pattern-seeking creatures, and late at night especially, enough threads laid side by side can begin resembling a tapestry. So please, I do urge you not to take any of this to the bank. As I said at the beginning of this chapter, we are here to explore speculation and follow the rabbit hole wherever it happens to lead. Regardless of the truth behind any of it, there was a day when America lost its leader, and however that day came about, it was a tragedy. Behind every theory, every document, every whispered claim and shadow cast backward through history, there remains a very real moment that profoundly affected millions of people. And perhaps that matters more than anything else. But within the context of ufology, as we close Chapter 3 tonight, Truman built the machinery, Eisenhower expanded it, and UFO mythology occasionally treats Kennedy as the moment when that machinery discovered something uncomfortable. Presidents come and go, while structures remain. And whether listeners place these stories among mysteries, folklore, or late-night speculation, there is a subtle emotional shift taking place beneath the surface. Because for the first time in our journey, it no longer feels as though the president stands at the center of the room. There's no doubt that tonight our first 3 presidents were perhaps more influential than any others in establishing the standard operating procedure when it came to dealing with the man who sits in the Oval Office. Because if the mythology we've explored tonight contains even fragments of truth, then by this stage something significant had already taken shape. Institutions had matured, intelligence structures had grown their roots, and systems built during moments of uncertainty had slowly eroded the very idea of democracy itself. These people were unelected, in it for the long haul, and bound by secrecy. Presidents, for all intents and purposes, are a product of the American dream of democracy. But secrets of this scale seem fundamentally at odds with that ideal. Democracy asks for transparency, accountability, and public trust. Whatever game may have been unfolding beneath the surface of the national security state appeared to operate according to very different rules. And so while Lyndon B. Johnson's story may feel quiet tonight, I suspect that silence itself may actually be saying something. Because perhaps the silence was the new status quo. For 5 years, there was very little. And there's a strange irony hidden inside that absence, because perhaps for the first time we can begin to recognize the difference between a president operating in control of the machinery and a president operating within machinery already moving under its own momentum. As we've discussed tonight, Eisenhower had his Holloman story. Its authenticity remains deeply contested, of course, but within the mythology, Eisenhower was there personally, standing beneath desert skies, and allegedly participating in extraordinary events firsthand. But when Holloman entered UFO lore again in 1964, the atmosphere felt completely different. There was no allegation of presidential involvement, no whispered stories of Lyndon Johnson boarding aircraft beneath cover stories, no claims of private negotiations, no suggestion that the president stood in the room at all. And perhaps that absence becomes more interesting than a presence. Because during the Johnson administration, filmmaker Robert Emenegger was producing the documentary UFOs Past, Present and Future. He claimed he had been granted access to Air Force and Department of Defense material, and was allegedly promised authentic military footage of a landing event at Holloman Air Force Base. The film supposedly showed 3 disc-shaped objects approaching the base while one descended and landed on extension pads before unusual occupants emerged. But before the documentary reached completion, the footage apparently vanished. Emenegger lately stated he had been told the entire episode may have represented government-sponsored disinformation, allegedly intended to study reactions and introduce confusion into UFO research. And while all of this unfolded, Johnson presided over an administration increasingly consumed by Vietnam, intelligence operations, and expanding systems of secrecy. Business as usual. America had entered a period where classified programs multiplied rapidly, and where hidden operations increasingly became part of the architecture of government. And perhaps that's why Johnson's chapter is quiet, because silence can occasionally mean nothing at all. But sometimes silence can mean that the machinery has stopped announcing itself. By now it may have simply expected everyone to understand the rules. In truth, it may represent a true change in power. Part of me wishes we could end it there. By the close of Johnson's administration, the new status quo appeared fully established. Decades of secrecy had settled into place, layer upon layer of compartmentalization, reinforcing one another, until the entire structure resembled a sealed vessel, moving through history. The machinery had become self-sustaining, and perhaps for a moment it seemed as though the mystery had finally disappeared beneath the weight of its own secrecy. And perhaps that would have been the case, had it not been for the man who next became Commander-in-Chief, Richard Nixon. So what exactly made Nixon different? Why not simply continue the Johnson arrangement and keep him comfortably separated from whatever hidden machinery may have existed behind the curtain? After all, according to the mythology we've explored tonight, that approach appeared to function perfectly well. But perhaps there was a problem with that idea. Perhaps Nixon already knew too much. Because before becoming president, Richard Nixon spent 8 years serving as vice president under Dwight Eisenhower, which places him in a very unusual position within the larger story. If Eisenhower represented the final administration in which the presidency maintained meaningful proximity to the center of the UFO issue, then Nixon may have arrived carrying institutional memory from a world that no longer existed. Within ufology, researchers often suggest that Nixon entered office already understanding where certain doors were located. He knew who to speak to, which names mattered, and perhaps more importantly, he knew where power had once lived. He had spent years standing beside Eisenhower during the exact period when stories involved Edwards, Holloman, MJ-12, and secret negotiations allegedly entered presidential mythology. And if one follows that line of thinking for just a moment, the next part of the story feels inevitable. Surely, Nixon becomes the president who regains control. Surely this is where the commander-in-chief turns the machinery of secrecy back toward himself. Surely this becomes the moment where hidden systems are dragged back beneath presidential authority, and long-locked doors quietly begin opening once again. That would have been nice, wouldn't it? No. Nixon instead played ball, maintained the secrecy for reasons that feel strangely familiar. Disclosure represented too great a risk because revealing an advanced non-human presence would destabilize the very foundations of society: religions, markets, governments, and public trust. And of course, then arrives the issue of the Cold War. If recovered technologies genuinely existed, and if reverse engineering efforts had begun taking place beneath military secrecy, then silence itself became strategic. Information represented leverage, and of course, leverage represented power. And there may have been one final burden resting in the background. Because if one accepts the mythology even briefly, disclosure would not simply reveal unusual truths about unidentified visitors. It would expose those decades of deception, and perhaps reveal that administrations stretching backward through history had all participated, willingly or otherwise, in maintaining that silence. So in ufology, Nixon never regained control at all. In fact, some stories suggest precisely the opposite. In fact, by the late 1960s, the UFO issue had allegedly drifted beyond presidential oversight entirely, moving instead toward those deeper structures, intelligence channels, private contractors, whatever form MJ-12 had evolved into. And while Nixon may have played ball, that doesn't mean he was entirely happy with this new status quo. The frustration of no longer having that control, while at the same time possessing such shattering knowledge, may have led to what came next. The period that ufologists fondly refer to as the cosmic Watergate. Because among all presidential UFO stories, Nixon's most famous account carries an atmosphere unlike any other in tonight's journey. It unfolds almost like a film scene unfolding somewhere beyond the edge of memory. Long dark roads stretch through South Florida beneath scattered streetlights while palm trees drift quietly past black presidential windows. Somewhere in the distance, ocean air moves through warm evening darkness, while a president and a celebrity travel toward a place they were never expected to discuss afterward. On February 19th, 1973, Nixon and Jackie Gleason spent time together publicly in Florida during Gleason's Inverary golf tournament. Presidential schedules, White House photographs, and Nixon's official diary all confirm their appearance together that day. But then the road begins fading into uncertainty. Because the UFO story itself doesn't emerge until years later, through Beverly Gleason, Jackie's former wife, who claimed that Gleason returned home late one evening and described a deeply unsettling experience involving Nixon, Homestead Air Force Base, and preserved non-human bodies. Beverly reaffirmed elements of the story during interviews, recalling Gleason returning home excited and describing, quote, dead little men. And over time, like many stories in ufology, additional layers slowly gathered at the edges. Larry Warren, a witness to the famous Rendlesham Forest incident in 1980, later claimed that Gleason personally repeated the account to him prior to his death, but this version expanded considerably and introduced additional details involving guarded facilities, unusual wreckage, and perhaps most memorably, preserved bodies displayed in what Gleason described as glass-topped Coke freezers. Now, UFO stories occasionally possess a strange talent for producing details that remain lodged in the imagination, but that one, surely, gets close to the top of the list. Richard Nixon's role in ufology could perhaps be characterized as a man increasingly resigned to the control mechanisms surrounding him. Whether that came from intuition, experience, or simply spending long enough inside the machinery remains impossible to know. But Nixon does feel different from the presidents who came before him. Nixon carries a different energy. There are moments within the mythology where he almost appears to understand the shape of the game being played around him. Perhaps that realization brought with it an important truth. Nixon's behavior under the watchful eye of MJ-12 may have offered an important lesson to the hidden structure operating behind the scenes. Keeping a president entirely in the dark may not actually represent the most effective way of maintaining control. Presidents, after all, shape public perception. They speak to nations during moments of uncertainty. They calm fears, direct attention, and help define reality for millions of people. Perhaps the better strategy involved something more subtle. Allow access. Offer fragments. Provide enough information for a president to feel involved, respected, and informed, while ensuring the larger decisions remain comfortably beyond reach. a system where the occupant of the Oval Office still sat at the center of the White House, but not at the center of the system of control. Truman was the architect, Eisenhower the expansionist, JFK the test of power, Johnson the result of that test, and Nixon perhaps the refinement of the status quo. By now tonight, a pattern has emerged beneath the surface of our journey. Presidents arrive at the White House believing they are inheriting authority, while ufology leads us to another conclusion. The men stepping into the White House weren't there to make the decisions. They were there as tools to serve a purpose. These men didn't inherit authority. They inherited the shackles managed by a secret that was now in the hands of other men. Controlling that secret is the source of power, and by extension, managing perception becomes not only paramount, but in fact a conduit for further consolidation of that power. Which brings us to Gerald Ford. Long before Gerald Ford became President of the United States, before Watergate unexpectedly delivered him to the Oval Office, and before history remembered him as America's first unelected president, he had already crossed paths with the UFO subject. More importantly, he encountered it in a way that feels very different from the stories surrounding Eisenhower or Nixon. There were no secret desert meetings and no late-night presidential motorcades disappearing toward military facilities, and certainly no stories involving hidden rooms or preserved bodies. Ford instead stumbled into something quieter. He stumbled into the public-facing side of the mystery. In March of 1966, while serving as House Minority Leader and representing Michigan's 5th Congressional District, Ford watched his home state become the center of one of the most publicized UFO waves in American history. Reports emerging from Dexter and Hillsdale rapidly expanded from local curiosity into a national story involving police officers, students, deputies, and ordinary citizens describing unusual objects and strange lights in the sky. Public concern grew rapidly, and media attention followed closely behind. But then came the explanation. Astronomer J. Allen Hynek publicly suggested that some of the sightings may have involved glowing gases released from swampy terrain under unusual atmospheric conditions. The explanation was more nuanced than history often remembers, but over time, almost every detail except 2 words quietly disappeared. Swamp gas. Those words escaped into public culture immediately and took on their own life. Decades later, they would survive as shorthand for explanations that felt strangely dismissive or completely disconnected from the experience people believed they had witnessed. Even now, many people recognize the phrase while remembering very little about the original events themselves. And Gerald Ford appeared deeply dissatisfied with the handling of the situation. His reaction is interesting because Ford never claimed extraterrestrials had visited Earth. In fact, he later clarified exactly the opposite, and openly suggested that some sightings might involve military experimentation or conventional explanations. His concern seemed focused somewhere else. He argued that citizens deserved, quote, the greatest possible enlightenment, and publicly called for congressional hearings because he believed the American public was entitled to a more convincing explanation. Irrespective of Ford's attempts to honor the testimony of his constituents, the phrase swamp gas did become a humorous jab at ufology from the outside, trivializing it, minimizing the seriousness. It set a precedent that would affect the public's perception of ufology for decades to come, in many ways enshrining a stigma that can still be felt today. And within ufology, it's a symbol of just how far the government is willing to stretch reasonable standards of logic in order to push a particular narrative. And what of J. Allen Hynek? After all, he's the man that presented the idea, and he was deeply involved with the United States Air Force's UFO investigation, Project Blue Book. Well, as it happens, Hynek deeply regretted how that explanation permeated throughout culture. At the time, he was lampooned heavily for the ridiculousness of the idea. But still, his words stuck. Several witnesses, including County Sheriff Douglas Harvey, later claimed Hynek privately told them he didn't know what the lights were, but he got a mysterious phone call from Washington, D.C., ordering him to call it swamp gas. The Michigan incident and the government's rush to dismiss it caused Hynek to severely trust the Air Force's handling of the subject. Over time, Hynek shifted from being a staunch debunker to believing that some UFO cases warranted serious, open-minded, scientific study, and eventually he left to found the Center for UFO Studies. Ford's short presidency almost feels like a return to the same stonewalling he had encountered years earlier during his time in Congress. If Michigan represented his first encounter with the public-facing machinery surrounding the UFO issue, then his years in the Oval Office seemed to offer very little reason to believe anything had changed. Ford's chapter almost symbolizes the first clear moment where the deeper structure appears to stop negotiating entirely. Earlier stories involved meetings, tensions and questions, and presidents pulling against the edges of hidden systems. But by now, less negotiation, less resistance, and more resignation. We understand that you want the truth, but we simply don't care. That public-facing attitude would seem to define much of the next several decades. But every president is different, and every president represents a different problem to be managed. Some arrive carrying institutional loyalty, some inherit old relationships, and some step into office already asking questions that make those hidden structures too uncomfortable. And if a president builds elements of his election campaign around promises of openness and disclosure, simply stonewalling him may create a problem of its own. Silence itself can become revealing. Refusal can occasionally confirm more than cooperation ever could. And eventually people begin to notice the shape of the curtain itself. So what exactly do you do with a president determined to find the truth? And what do you do with a man who fully intends to share it? You give him a reason not to. The story of the Jimmy Carter briefing is one of the most interesting tales in ufology. It has become representative of the idea that finding out the truth can be so ontologically shocking that it changes you on a fundamental level. This mythical, indigestible truth can find its roots here, in the late 1970s, among a presidency that conversely promised to share the truth. Carter entered the Oval Office carrying a personal relationship with the subject itself. Jimmy Carter had seen something. The sighting itself remains among the best documented presidential UFO reports in American history. In 1973, while serving as governor of Georgia, Carter submitted a signed and handwritten UFO report describing a bright object observed after dark near Leary, Georgia. The object reportedly shifted in brightness and changed colors while remaining visible for roughly 10 to 12 minutes, before eventually disappearing. Unlike many public figures discussing UFOs during that time, Carter approached the subject with a kind of sincerity that feels rare. Years later, he famously remarked that he would never laugh at someone claiming to have seen a UFO, because he'd seen one himself. That sentiment may sound small, but within the larger story we've been following tonight, it changes the landscape, because Carter entered office carrying curiosity of a much more personal variety. He believed witnesses deserved respect, he believed questions deserved answers, and perhaps most significantly of all, he entered office carrying promises. During his '76 campaign, Carter made statements suggesting that information concerning UFOs should become publicly available. Surviving records preserve comments supporting the release of UFO-related information, quote, on a public basis, creating expectations that followed him all the way into the White House. And perhaps after tonight's journey, you can now see that the problem of presidential curiosity is a unique one, and Carter presented something altogether more complicated, because he entered office already curious, already personally invested, and already publicly associated with transparency. Simply stonewalling a president like that has the potential to create risks of its own. A president publicly stating they've been locked out of aspects of the intelligence community when it's supposed to exist inside the executive branch would be a huge scandal, one that would shine even more unwanted light on hidden secrets. And perhaps that's why Jimmy Carter occupies such a fascinating position inside UFO mythology. Because according to the stories, Carter entered office and eventually began asking difficult questions, only once again to discover that becoming president did not necessarily mean inheriting unrestricted access to every hidden room inside government. Now, the official record contains White House memoranda and administrative correspondence that suggests Carter's administration followed the UFO issue in a highly bureaucratic manner. Questions were routed toward NASA, archival material, and freedom of information processes, rather than sweeping disclosure efforts, and internal discussions eventually framed Carter's campaign promises as already fulfilled, because existing Air Force records had become publicly accessible through archives and FOIA requests. And yet there is something so painful hidden inside this response. Because after years of public interest, campaign promises, and what seemed to be genuine curiosity, the answer appears to have slowly transformed into yet another procedural shrug. The files already exist, nothing more to see. Move along. Now, why would a president so set on disclosure seemingly join the ranks of his predecessors and play ball with the group in control of the secrets? The obvious answer, of course, is that there was simply nothing there when he looked. That's the go-to line, isn't it? UFO mythology, however, rarely allows stories to end in places like that. Over time, another narrative emerged, one considerably darker, and far more emotionally powerful. According to the story, Carter eventually requested access to deeply classified UFO information, and received a highly restricted briefing involving a program called Project Aquarius. The details surrounding this story vary considerably, depending on the source, but one image has stayed the same all this time. Jimmy Carter, returning to the Oval Office, sitting quietly at the resolute desk, lowering his head into his hands, and weeping. Now, we can only guess what changed, but Carter himself later rejected stronger extraterrestrial interpretations surrounding both his own sighting and broader UFO claims, repeatedly stating that he never believed the object he observed came from outer space. But within UFO lore, the story has continued evolving regardless. This is where Eric Davis enters the picture. Dr. Eric Davis is a physicist associated with advanced propulsion studies and long-standing UAP research efforts, whose discussions concerning executive oversight have circulated widely in the UFO community. In interviews, Davis has presented Carter's alleged briefing as a rare example of formal presidential access to deeply compartmentalized information. And according to those accounts, briefing papers were shown briefly and immediately collected afterward, leaving almost no conventional paper trail behind. Now, Davis says that the versions of these briefing materials circulating publicly today are not the original classified copies. Instead, Davis describes them as facsimiles reconstructed afterward through what he called a process of memory convergence. Staff members reportedly involved in the original oral briefing later reconvened at a hotel and attempted to recreate the contents together from memory. Each individual allegedly wrote down remembered details onto legal pads before passing them around in a kind of round-robin exercise, gradually refining and correcting details until a collective version had been agreed upon. That reconstructed document was later typed using an electric thermal printer and, according to the story, eventually formed the basis for versions of the Project Aquarius materials that later entered ufology. Carter's infamous emotional reaction became one of the most enduring images in all presidential UFO mythology. But the story was never really about tears. It was about transformation. As someone with a self-confessed deep interest in finding the truth, I constantly assume that when that moment finally comes, I'll feel an overwhelming sense of relief, perhaps even joy. Jimmy Carter appeared to share that same deep interest and curiosity, but according to the mythology surrounding his briefing, his experience unfolded very differently. Instead, the image that survives is one of Carter withdrawing behind the resolute desk, with his head lowered into his hands. Eric Davis suggests that the gesture itself reflects Carter's familiar way of praying as a famously religious man, which perhaps changes the image slightly, but not necessarily its emotional weight. Either way, whatever Carter was allegedly told appeared to change him. And over time, people increasingly reached for a phrase that has now become deeply embedded within modern discussions surrounding the phenomenon: ontological shock. The idea that some truths do not simply challenge beliefs but instead shake the foundations beneath them. There have been endless debates surrounding what this mythical, indigestible truth might actually be, and some figures within ufology do occasionally claim to know the answer, but remarkably, few ever seem willing to discuss it directly. Personally, I have always found that difficult to imagine, because if I finally learned the truth behind all of this, I suspect I would spend the rest of my life talking about it. But maybe I'm wrong. Perhaps that's too much of an assumption. What if Carter learned of the same horrifying historical threads that Kennedy may have uncovered surrounding Project Paperclip and the long shadows cast by its legacy within American intelligence systems? What if Carter was shown something that shook his religious beliefs to their core? Whatever he allegedly learned, the mythology increasingly treats that moment as a turning point, because afterward his position on disclosure appeared to change considerably. Perhaps the most effective way to stop a president determined to tell the world the truth is to give him it. Whatever briefing Carter received, perhaps its success in suppressing the truth served as the blueprint for presidencies to come. Whether the briefing material itself was factual or disinformation becomes secondary, because as mythology, it certainly achieves its purpose A president entered office promising transparency, carrying a deeply personal interest in the UFO subject, and allegedly emerged from the experience quieter, more reserved, and less eager to pull back the curtain. And perhaps with our next president, we may even catch a glimpse into the mind of someone who had already faced difficult truths and somehow emerged from the other side, carrying a renewed sense of duty, not merely toward America, perhaps not even toward East or West, but toward humanity as a whole, before it was too late. Earlier chapters often revolved around hidden rooms, inherited systems, and stories of presidents being denied access. Reagan feels different. The atmosphere surrounding him carries a curious optimism, as though whatever ideas attached themselves to the phenomenon gradually became folded into a larger belief that humanity itself might one day have to outgrow its divisions. According to UFO lore, shortly after entering office in March of 1981, Reagan allegedly received a deeply classified briefing at Camp David concerning the true nature of the UFO phenomenon. According to proponents of the story, the briefing was supposedly delivered by a CIA contractor and carried a classification beyond ordinary top secret. Accounts vary considerably, of course, depending on who tells them, but the broad shape remains consistent. Reagan was allegedly briefed on the history of extraterrestrial visitation, the government's long-standing secrecy surrounding the subject, and humanity's hidden relationship with a phenomenon operating beneath modern history. The story serves an important narrative purpose. Reagan's chapter increasingly begins feeling like the continuation of a process we may have witnessed with Jimmy Carter. Carter may have represented the first great experiment in controlled disclosure, and Reagan may represent the refinement of that new model. No longer total denial, no longer complete separation, instead something a little subtler. Provide enough truth to orient the president inside the machinery, but perhaps never enough for him to steer it. But what if its influence leaked, intentionally or otherwise, beyond the borders of the pages and into rhetoric? Because throughout the later years of the Cold War, Ronald Reagan repeatedly returned to an idea that feels familiar. He imagined humanity confronted by an external intelligence, a presence arriving from beyond the boundaries of Earth itself, and he wondered, aloud, what such an event would do to us. More specifically, he wondered whether it would finally force us to stop fighting one another. In November of 1985, during discussions surrounding the Geneva summit, Reagan reportedly introduced a thought experiment involving extraterrestrial life approaching Earth. A declassified memorandum from discussions with Soviet leadership records Reagan imagining, quote, some alien life form approaching on Halley's Comet, suggesting that knowledge of such an event could unite humanity. Only weeks later, while speaking at Falston High School in Maryland, Reagan publicly recalled a similar conversation. If suddenly there was a threat to this world from some other species, from another planet, outside in the universe. And then perhaps most famously of all, came the United Nations speech on September 21st, 1987. I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world. And yet, I ask you, is not an alien force already among us? Now, historically speaking, context matters, because the official speech immediately pivots back toward war itself as the true alien force, making the broader meaning considerably more grounded than later retellings would imply. Reagan repeatedly used extraterrestrial language as a rhetoric device within discussions surrounding diplomacy, nuclear danger, and cooperation between rival powers. The question I'm merely suggesting we ask, however, is whether or not that rhetoric had a starting point. Reagan didn't use the analogy just once. He used it repeatedly. Publicly and privately, he used it with school children, and he used it with Soviet leaders. And according to ufology, that rhetoric may indeed have been backed up with action. In 1983, Ronald Reagan unveiled one of the most ambitious and controversial defense proposals of the entire Cold War period, the Strategic Defense Initiative, more commonly known as SDI. History would eventually remember it by another name entirely: Star Wars. Officially, SDI represented a radical rethinking of nuclear defense strategy. Throughout much of the Cold War, peace had rested upon a deeply uncomfortable concept known as mutually assured destruction, a doctrine suggesting that nuclear war remained unlikely precisely because both sides understood that launching first would guarantee catastrophic retaliation. Reagan disliked the idea of humanity's future depending upon the promise of total annihilation, and SDI emerged from an attempt to imagine an alternative. The proposal envisioned a vast defensive network involving satellites, advanced targeting systems, tracking technologies, and directed energy weapons, capable of intercepting ballistic missiles before they ever reached their targets. To supporters, it represented a technological leap forward, while critics viewed it as an enormously expensive fantasy or a strategic bluff designed to pressure the Soviet Union into unsustainable competition. Historians today generally place SDI within that broader Cold War context, and often interpret it as a combination of military ambition, technological aspiration, and geopolitical pressure. But UFO mythology eventually wandered toward a very different interpretation. Reagan's repeated fascination with extraterrestrial scenarios slowly became intertwined with SDI itself, and over time, theorists began suggesting that the initiative's publicly stated purpose may only have represented part of the story. The satellites, laser systems, and extraordinary tracking capabilities imagined under SDI looked to some researchers less like tools designed solely for incoming Soviet missiles, and more like the early architecture of something considerably larger, something planetary. Reagan's public remarks concerning extraterrestrial threats reflected more than philosophical speculation. Researchers proposed that SDI may have served a dual purpose, allowing the United States to openly pursue advanced orbital defense systems while privately preparing for possibilities extending far beyond just Cold War rivalries. Within this interpretation, Reagan was not merely attempting to build a shield against nuclear attack. He was preparing humanity for first contact, or perhaps preparing for the possibility that not every visitor arriving from elsewhere would necessarily arrive peacefully. This begs the question, if Reagan received the talk, what exactly was he told? Was he given the same briefing that Carter received? Was the disturbing realization that danger was just around the corner the catalyst for his rhetoric and ambitious space-based defense system? And lastly, there is one more story that some people see as evidence of Reagan's secret knowledge on the topic. Following a White House screening of E.T. the Extraterrestrial in 1982, Reagan allegedly leaned toward Steven Spielberg and quietly remarked, "There are a number of people in this room who know that everything on that screen is absolutely true." The quotation remains widely repeated and frustratingly difficult to verify through contemporary documentation. But within UFO circles, it's settled comfortably into the Reagan mythology. This chapter almost feels like meeting someone who looked toward the horizon and concluded that humanity's future might ultimately depend on learning how small we really are. Perhaps Carter allegedly encountered a truth so overwhelming that it withdrew him inward. Perhaps Reagan encountered that same mystery and looked outward instead. Among all the presidents we've followed tonight, Reagan occasionally feels like the first who began speaking less as a national leader and more as someone contemplating humanity itself. And if UFO mythology offers a lesson hidden inside this story, perhaps it's this. Some people encounter mystery and become frightened. Others encounter mystery and begin imagining what comes next. Just when you thought we might have turned a corner toward a more unified vision of disclosure, toward a president standing at a podium and changing the world with 4 simple words, we are instead ushered into an era where the deep state quietly reminds us who is really in charge. As we enter a period that still feels highly relevant today, or perhaps at least until very recently, the atmosphere has changed once again. Reagan had spent years speaking about humanity as a single people beneath the stars, imagining a future where our differences dissolved beneath the realization that we were part of something larger. For a brief moment, late at night, it almost felt as though we had been drifting toward something hopeful. But history occasionally has a habit of closing doors just as your hand reaches for the handle. Because in 1989, George H.W. Bush entered office, and unlike many of the presidents we've followed tonight, here stood a man arriving with a resume already deeply intertwined with intelligence. Bush had served as director of the CIA, vice president of the United States, and spent decades moving through corridors where secrecy functioned as currency. Standing here was a man who understood power, understood compartmentalization, and perhaps understood better than most how information itself could be weaponized. His time as Director of Central Intelligence placed him at the center of oversight structures governing highly sensitive intelligence operations, and gave him direct involvement in shaping national intelligence. Bush's presidency was unique. Truman built structures, Eisenhower allegedly watched them grow, Kennedy questioned them, and Carter supposedly encountered the psychological weight of hidden truths. Bush, meanwhile, entered office as a man already fluent in the language of compartmentalization, and ufology noticed that immediately. Bush gradually became associated with what researchers sometimes refer to as the legacy program, a supposed long-running architecture of retrieval programs, intelligence structures, and hidden operations persisting beneath changing administrations. The reasoning itself felt fairly straightforward. If anyone should have known where the doors were hidden, Bush appeared as obvious a candidate as any. And perhaps the first moment feeding that belief arrived before he entered office. During a 1988 campaign stop in Rogers, Arkansas, a UFO researcher named Charles Huffer asked Bush whether he would tell the American people the truth about UFOs if elected president. According to later archival material preserving this exchange, Bush initially responded playfully before offering a reply that has lingered inside UFO circles ever since. I know some. I know a fair amount. For a man deeply experienced in intelligence language, those words occupy an unusual middle ground. He didn't deny the subject entirely, nor dismiss it as fantasy. He instead answered almost like someone accustomed to discussing compartmentalized information, someone acknowledging that a secret, whether true or false, is a form of power, and thus can be weaponized. And perhaps that detail becomes more interesting when viewed alongside another story that later emerged around Bush, one involving Holloman Air Force Base once again. According to Eric Davis, Bush allegedly shared the extraordinary accounts concerning the famous Holloman landing story years after leaving office. According to Davis, Bush privately described the 1964 event involving 3 craft approaching Holloman Air Force Base, one of which allegedly landing while a non-human entity exited and interacted with military and intelligence personnel. The funny thing is, Bush had been told this information by mistake. As the incoming director of the CIA, a Department of Defense liaison officer mistakenly assumed Bush had already been read in on the subject and began briefing him on the details of the landing. And perhaps the strangest part of this story arrives afterward, because according to the same account, Bush explained that when he later attempted to learn more while serving as director, he encountered a response that feels impossible to ignore. Bush allegedly requested access to further material and was informed that he had not yet reached the required threshold of need to know. If true, that indicates that power had perhaps migrated from government entities altogether into the hands of individuals that didn't have to hold a rank or special title. Perhaps somewhere between Eisenhower and Bush Sr., secrecy had made its way into the private sector, and thus sheltering it further from government oversight and protecting it from Freedom of Information Act requests. The presidents before him had been standing before locked doors and hidden rooms, and we thought George H.W. Bush was supposed to be different. Bush was supposed to be the man already carrying the keys. He had occupied the highest intelligence position in the United States government, and understood the architecture of secrecy better than anyone who had entered the Oval Office previously. And yet, according to the mythology, even he encountered limits. Even he encountered thresholds. Even he encountered walls. A former CIA director, vice president, and commander-in-chief could allegedly hear the phrase, "need to know." Perhaps nobody truly stood at the center anymore. At some point, systems can become so deeply compartmentalized that they begin operating almost independently of the people who created them. A system now so fractured that secrecy no longer belongs to anyone. But the secret itself is very much alive. The secret still exists behind a locked door, but no single person has the key. Perhaps a better analogy would be that fragments of that secret exist behind many locked doors, some with keys and some without. But crucially, this is now a system that works against itself, with no one able to view the entire picture. First, the White House lost control. Then the intelligence community lost control. Now we may well have a secret without a keeper. But there is another phrase for that. Lost knowledge. For much of tonight's story, the mythology felt relatively straightforward, at least in broad terms. Truman built the machinery, Eisenhower inherited it before watching parts of it drift beyond direct control. Kennedy may have challenged it. Carter supposedly encountered its psychological weight, and Bush Sr. eventually arrived as perhaps the most qualified president imaginable to navigate these hidden systems of secrecy, intelligence, and compartmentalization. And even he appears to have encountered locked doors. But perhaps we've been asking the wrong question all along, because throughout tonight we have repeatedly returned to the same question. Who controls the secret? We imagined hidden committees, unseen figures, intelligence directors, military structures and shadowy groups operating behind curtains. We assumed there must be a center to all of this. Somewhere there had to be a room containing the people who knew everything. Now I have no doubt that at some point that room existed, and it likely had people in it. But now, maybe nobody remains in that room at all. Because with George Bush Sr., I think we may have crossed into a phase I can only really describe as lost knowledge, the secret without a keeper. As I said, if we're to believe ufological lore, first the presidency lost control. Then, the intelligence community itself gradually lost control, and eventually, the secret may have become so deeply compartmentalized, so fragmented and distributed across generations of bureaucracy, private contractors, inherited programs, and institutional handoffs, that nobody remained holding the complete picture. Not the president, not the CIA, perhaps not even the people operating inside the machinery itself. What if the people who originally understood the architecture disappeared decades ago, leaving behind disconnected procedures, partial records, and systems whose original purpose slowly faded from memory? This would represent something very different from secrecy. This would represent a secret with no path leading toward it. Very few traces remain, very few fingerprints, only fragments. Perhaps that changes everything. George H.W. Bush left office in 1993, and from that point onward, the relationship between presidents and the UFO subject feels very repetitive. Bill Clinton later spoke about attempting to look into matters involving Roswell and Area 51 through figures including John Podesta and Webster Hubble, describing efforts to ask questions and the search for answers that ultimately appeared to lead nowhere. George Bush Jr. later offered his own version of silence with his now famous "I ain't telling you nothing," while Barack Obama would eventually smile during interviews and provide his own carefully measured variations involving what he could and could not reveal. And after the numerous humour-filled responses, he settled on a plain, "I can't reveal anything." What we think of as a president hiding the existence of alien life and UFOs might actually be something else taking place. Because if the mythology surrounding the idea of lost knowledge contains even a fragment of truth, then the President of the United States may no longer be encountering active gatekeepers at all. Perhaps they're merely inheriting documents, inheriting records, inheriting carefully preserved briefing material, passed from administration to administration, long after the original foundations beneath those briefings have disappeared. And perhaps somewhere among those materials sits something like Project Aquarius. Because imagine for a moment that such a document genuinely existed. Imagine it survived decades of classified transitions and administrative handoffs, carefully preserved and quietly delivered from one presidency to the next. Imagine a president sitting inside a secure room, receiving extraordinary material, carrying classifications of immense significance. Only there's one problem. Nobody can verify it anymore. If the original programs fragmented decades earlier, if recovered materials disappeared into private industry, vanished beneath layers of compartmentalization, or simply faded as witnesses retired or passed away, and institutions ran out of funding or evolved into something else entirely, then the knowledge itself begins changing shape. Information slowly becomes mythology, even in a presidency. Records become artifacts, and eventually a classified briefing starts resembling an ancient manuscript more than an intelligence assessment. Still secret, still protected, but increasingly powerless as each administration passes to the next. And perhaps that creates a deeply strange contradiction, because imagine inheriting information carrying the highest classifications imaginable, while simultaneously possessing no ability whatsoever to determine whether it remains accurate, incomplete, misunderstood, or entirely detached from the original truth that created it. Sharing it publicly becomes impossible because classification still binds it, but revealing it may also accomplish almost nothing, because without evidence, without recovered material, without bodies, and without the physical reality that allegedly gave rise to the story in the first place, all that remains are fragments, stories, claims, inherited memories. And if tonight's mythology really has drifted this far from its beginnings, perhaps the ultimate irony slowly begins revealing itself. Because after nearly 80 years of secrecy, perhaps the final consequence was never perfect control at all. Perhaps the secret simply became lost. Now, when I say that, I'm not suggesting that nobody knows anything worth pursuing anymore, because after all, I remain a firm advocate for complete and total disclosure of as much information surrounding the phenomenon as possible. I don't believe every single lead has gone cold, every witness has disappeared, or every hidden corridor has finally emptied itself. But perhaps the challenge today looks very different from the challenge faced by Eisenhower, Kennedy, Carter, or Reagan. Because if you're the president now, who exactly do you ask? You've already spoken to the intelligence community, and while interesting fragments may still exist, those pathways increasingly seem to lead nowhere. You may pass people in the White House hallways carrying extraordinary pieces of information, people holding deeply interesting secrets gathered across careers spent moving through obscure corners of government and defense structures. Though if you never realize that person carries a piece of the puzzle, how do you ever know to ask the question in the first place? Perhaps what I'm trying to say is this. Disclosure may not simply be a matter of standing at a podium and telling the world what you know. Because even active, unacknowledged special access programs may not fully understand one another's existence, let alone possess visibility into details hidden beyond their walls. The deeper we move into the modern era, the more the landscape begins resembling something diluted by decades of bureaucracy, private industry, classification structures, and institutional inheritance. And eventually the machinery becomes so fragmented that nobody remains standing at the center. If tonight's mythology contains even fragments of truth, perhaps there is no final vault, no central archive, no single keeper waiting beside a locked door. Perhaps all that remains now are pieces, fragments, disconnected truths moving quietly through separate corridors. And if that's where we find ourselves today, then perhaps the final card remaining on the table is not disclosure in the form many people imagine. Perhaps it's revelation, one truth emerging, followed by another, then another, then another, until eventually enough fragments gather together that for the first time in generations, humanity begins putting the entire picture, the entire secret, back together again. And so now we find ourselves within a highly divisive presidency that, whatever your political leanings, continues revealing something familiar from earlier chapters tonight. Information itself increasingly becoming weaponized, this time for political gain on both sides of the aisle. But beneath the headlines, the campaign battles, and the endless modern noise, something else appears to be happening quietly in the background. For the first time in decades, we may be witnessing an administration that's willing to admit that it too may be running into walls. Earlier presidents often project certainty, even when UFO mythology suggests otherwise. Publicly, they maintain the image that the machinery of government remains under control. But during this period, there appears to be moments where the possibility of institutional resistance and hidden structures unexpectedly drift closer toward the surface, irrespective of the image the administration wishes to portray. Perhaps that matters because if tonight's journey follows a larger pattern, then we arrived here by moving through several transformations. Truman helped create the machinery. Eisenhower watched it expand beyond direct oversight. Kennedy questioned those hidden structures. Carter encountered the emotional weight of forbidden knowledge, and Bush Sr. eventually carried us into the idea of lost knowledge, a world where the secret itself became so deeply fragmented that the idea of a single keeper gradually stopped making sense. Perhaps Donald Trump entered office at precisely the moment those fractures finally began to become visible again. During Trump's administration, the wider atmosphere surrounding UFOs has changed dramatically. For decades, the subject largely existed in a strange territory between ridicule and curiosity, and quietly orbited around documentaries, late-night radio, and occasional moments of public fascination. But then, very unexpectedly, the conversation shifted. The New York Times published its now famous reporting concerning the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. Military footage entered public discussion. Navy pilots began speaking openly, and unidentified aerial phenomena slowly started to step out from the cultural shadows. For the first time in generations, people inside official structures appeared to publicly acknowledge that something unusual may genuinely be occurring. And perhaps more interestingly, they don't always seem to agree with one another. Within the framework of lost knowledge, these disagreements are fascinating. They reveal that fragmentation. It implies that there are missing pieces. It suggests that perhaps nobody possesses the complete picture anymore, and that different groups may now be operating with entirely different understandings of the very same mystery. During interviews, Donald Trump repeatedly hints that he has heard interesting things, but he avoids certainty. His remarks regarding Roswell carry exactly that quality. He suggests that he knows very interesting things while declining to elaborate, leaving audiences in that strange territory between teasing humour and genuine ambiguity. Perhaps he genuinely does know something, or perhaps, as I've suggested, he inherited fragments. David Grush, the intelligence officer whose testimony dramatically reshaped modern UFO discussions, repeatedly describes extraordinarily compartmentalized legacy structures existing beyond ordinary oversight channels. In Grush's description, knowledge appears distributed across isolated compartments, where individuals only understand small portions of a much larger picture. The picture he paints does not resemble a president entering a room and receiving complete answers. Instead, it resembles an immense maze of inherited structures, fragmented authority, and pieces of information separated so effectively that understanding the whole picture becomes nearly impossible. And if one follows the logic of tonight's journey, that makes sense. Grush's testimony almost feels like a modern expression of something we closely watched unfold tonight. Maybe presidents are briefed. Maybe documents still exist. Maybe something resembling Project Aquarius still survives, passed carefully through inherited channels from one administration to the next. But perhaps what those briefings represent changes considerably over time. Because being read into a secret no longer necessarily means inheriting power over it. Earlier in tonight's journey, we imagined presidents gaining access to hidden systems and secret machinery, but perhaps by the modern era that relationship reverses. Perhaps presidents now inherit records whose foundations disappeared decades earlier. They may receive extraordinary claims, institutional memories and classified stories, but they possess almost no ability to determine whether those materials remain complete, accurate, or even connected to anything physically recoverable. To put it simply, it's not enough. And now the presidency looks a little different. A president can inherit some secrets, but possess almost no mechanism to prove them true. And so disclosure may no longer arrive through a president standing at a podium announcing the truth to humanity, though I hope that happens. No, perhaps disclosure now arrives through a series of collisions, through whistleblowers, congressional hearings, oversight failures, leaked videos, and fragments unexpectedly finding one another across a world where information moves faster than ever before. Perhaps this is where I find myself quietly optimistic. Because information today behaves differently than it did during Truman's America. Connections now form instantly. Archives communicate with one another. Researchers compare details in real time, and isolated fragments can suddenly discover missing partners sitting thousands of miles away. Perhaps we no longer require direct access to the legacy programs in order to rebuild the larger picture. And if those fragments emerge in enough quantity, eventually the shape of something hidden begins revealing itself, whether it intends to or not. This has the potential to create a deeply uncomfortable problem for anyone still guarding pieces of the original secret. Because if power once came through controlling that information, what happens when that information itself becomes impossible to contain? If tonight's mythology contains even a fragment of truth, then perhaps all it takes is one program revealing itself. One hidden corridor unexpectedly opening. One fragment finally colliding with another. Perhaps if that happens, decades of secrecy will stop resembling a locked vault and instead begin to resemble a flood. Maybe the original secret lost its keeper long ago, but perhaps now we have the power to find our own way back to the truth. Good night.